it always intrigued me to get a little bit of a glimpse of a vision of Yosef HaTzadik. So I'd like to study various pieces and presentations of the Meshech Chochma related to Yosef HaTzadik. The first one will come actually from the beginning of the Torah, from Parshas Bereishis. And the only drawback to this approach, because I think we covered most of what we wanted to say in Vayigash last year, but the drawback to this approach is that we'll be jumping around. That's the nature of the game. But we're going to begin now with Rameir Simcha's presentation to the pasuk in Bereishis Beis, pasuk Tezayin. We're not going to read the entire piece. It's a long presentation. I just want to sort of glide us into a focus on Yosef HaTzadik. And who would believe that as early as Parshas Bereishis, Rameir Simcha sees already Yosef HaTzadik on the horizon. That's how important Yosef is. And the Torah says, "Vayitzav Hashem Elokim al Adam lemar, mikol eitz hagan achol tochel." And Rameir Simcha is worried about the extra word lemar. What does it mean? And he quotes a very interesting Gemara in Meshech Sanhedrin that finds a pasuk lemar in a pasuk in Yirmiyah, and that pasuk in Yirmiyah using the word lemar is going to shed a light on lemar here at the very beginning of the Torah in Bereishis. The Gemara tells us on the pasuk in Yirmiyah, where he says, "Lemar hein yishalach ish es ishto, v'holcha me'ito v'haisalish acher." So the word lemar appears together with v'haisa li'ish acher, which means a married woman who has a relationship with another man. And therefore, if we make this hekage, lemar, the Gemara concludes that this whole business about Eitz Hadas and Mikol Eitz Hagan Achol Tochal is all about Gilui Arayos. And at the end of the pasuk there, it says V'ata Zonisa. And the pasuk explicitly relates to Znus. Vatachnifi ha'aretz biznusayich u'b'reyasayich. It's very interesting that the land itself and its produce can be disloyal. And that parallels disloyalty, chas v'sholom, in the area of arayos. So that when it says, for example, in Parshas Kedoshim, v'lo tizneh ha'aretz, the Sifra adds three words, mezinin hein min haperos. So a person spends a great deal of time investing his funds, his energies into producing fruit from a tree. And the Torah warns us that if we're careful, then fine. If we're very careful about any sort of znus and chas v'sholom disloyalty in marriage, then the peros will produce. And mikol eitz hagan achol tochel. You're allowed to eat from all the eitzim, and they will produce the fruit that you will enjoy. But if, on the other hand, you are disloyal in a marriage situation with regard to Gilui Arayos, then we invoke a different pasuk, and that's lemar. That lemar means Gilui Arayos, and vatachnifi ha'aretz. That is going to be, so to speak, in a figurative sense, a znus on the part of the peros ha'aretz. This is another example. My Rebbe used to always talk about how our actions impact on the biological universe. And here's an example of this. The Torah is warning us that if we're immoral, that's going to have a negative influence on the peros. Harei onsho shel davar, says Rameir Simcha, what will be the punishment for arayos? The haperos mazinin, a very strange Hebrew syntax to speak about peros and describe them as mazinin, miloshen znus, v'atziras kishamin. And God is warning us that as a result of deviation from the loyalty a man and a woman have to have one to each other reciprocally in marriage, if there's disloyalty, that's going to lead to the termination of the rains falling from the heavens. So when we look at a situation of a drought or a famine in the land, and the land is not producing and the rains are not falling from the heavens, we should realize that that might be a pointer that the society is guilty of falling short in this area of Gili Arayos. V'ein re'uyim haperos lecho. And the fruits, even if they grow, they're not edible. Lachein tziva olav lemar. That's why here, at the beginning of the Torah, when God commands Adam and Chava to eat from the peros haaretz, achal teachal, it says lemar. Mikol eitz hagan achal teachal sheyirek shelo yizana ba'arayos. Be very careful about the area of sexual morality, and then you can eat from all the peros. And now Reb Meir Simcha wants to answer a question. What bothers his mind? In Vizos HaBracha, when Moshe Rabbeinu bestows the various blessings on the tribes of Israel, when he gets to Yosef HaTzadik, he gives them, the descendants of Yosef, a very special bracha. Mivareches arzo. He blesses the land of Yosef more than any of the other shvatim. Why? And the answer is, Shelozon Enov Barayos. If there's any person who is a perfect model, a manifestation of care, and very meticulous shmira in the area of Arayos, there's no one like Yosef HaTzadik. In fact, that's why we call him Yosef HaTzadik. And Chazal tell us that Yosef was such a handsome individual that the women in Mitzrayim would try to get his attention. They would throw jewels at him and other expensive items, and Yosef never even looked at them. He was very careful about his einayim. So Yosef now becomes the paradigm of shmira in this area of Arayos, and therefore he deserves the bracha that his land, agriculturally, will be the most successful, the most blessed land of all the lands in Israel, even those of the other Shvat. Fascinating insight of Reb Meir Simcha. And now we move on to another discussion about Yosef HaTzadik in the Meshech Chochma. And we're looking here at the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev. And don't worry, we'll get to Vayigash. And there, the pasuk says that the bar that they threw Yosef into was rake, it was empty, the Einbo Mayim, and it didn't have any water in it. And the Gemara asks, why the double language? If it's empty, obviously it doesn't have water. And the answer is that Mayim Einbo Aval Nechashim Vakravim Yeshbo. So this was a very dangerous bar. I mean, I'm understating it. And Chazal tell us that when Yosef was sent on his mission by Yaakov Avinu to meet the brothers and Lishol B'Shlomon, he stops off on the way to the place where he was thrown into the pit. In other words, he came to the pit, and there he recited a bracha. Blessed are you, O Lord, that you gave and protected me with a miracle in this place. And Reb Meir Simcha writes the following. Again, I'm going to just quote part of the words of his text. V'hinei b'Yosef Omar Rabbi Tanchuma b'Medrash. In the Medrash Tanchuma, you'll find about Yosef. Shebesha'a sheshav Yosef mikvuras aviv. When Yosef looked into the bar, he was mevarech barach shasali nes b'makom hazeh. And according to Tanchuma, this actually took place when Yosef was going to Canaan to pick up the remains of his father Yaakov and bury them. So he looks into the bar. And Rabbi Simcha asks, what is the miracle that transpired here that justified Yosef reciting the bracha, Baruch she'asa li nes b'makom hazeh? And there are two answers to this question, two possible answers. One is, shehelu min habar, that the brothers lifted him up from the bar. And the other is that as a result of getting out of the bar, he was able to go through this entire ishtalshalus in which he gets sold as an eved to Mitzrayim, etc., until he finally reaches the ultimate level of being a viceroy to Mitzrayim, to Paro. Which of the two nisim were greater than the other, was greater than the other? And which nes justified and obligated Yosef to recite this bracha? But Meir Simcha says that Yosef was a great scholar, and he analyzed this question. He came to the conclusion that the answers to these two questions are different. It's not necessarily so that the greater miracle requires a bracha. Why? There's no doubt that the greater miracle is the fact that Yosef now, through hashgacha, will succeed, and victoriously he will rise to the level of Malchus. That is a hashgacha, a divine providence that's going to lead to Yosef saving the entire globe, the entire universe. But that wasn't the nes that required a bracha, because Yosef understood that the nes that requires a bracha has to be a nes shelo b'derech hateva, something that is obviously against the laws of nature, defies the natural law. What was the nes that defied the natural law? It was the fact that the Nechashim v'Akravim did not kill Yosef in the bottom of the bar. The fact that the brothers lifted Yosef from the bottom of the bar and sold him as an eved, even though that was much more significant in the overall picture, but nevertheless, that's b'derech hateva. That was done through the intervention of human activity. But it was God who protected Yosef and saved him from the Nechashim and Akravim. That is the nes shelo al derech hateva, which generates a chiyuv bracha. Now we go to the end of Parshas Vayeshev. And we're going to look at two paragraphs in Reb Meir Simcha at the very end of the parsha. You recall, of course, that Yosef in the dungeon meets up with two officers in Paro's capital, and one is the Sarah Mashkim, the other is Sarah Ophim. They each have a dream, and Yosef interprets those dreams. And Yosef says to the Sarah Mashkim, "V'nasata kos Paro biyado k'mishpat harishon asher ha'isa m'shakev." And Yosef guarantees the Sarah Mashkim, based on his interpretation of the dream, that the Sarah Mashkim will be replaced. He will replace his original. He would again be reappointed to his original position. K'mishpat harishon asher ha'isa m'shakev. Says Reb Meir Simcha, very last paragraph of Parshas Vayeshev, Nira, Dimin Hashamayim Chaya. Now, Reb Meir Simcha asks the obvious question, which all the Mefarshim explain. Why is it that Yosef remains incarcerated in the bar for an extra period of time? Certainly Hashem could have done a miracle, and immediately after interpreting the dream of the Sarah Mashkim being replaced back to his old position, he would have told Paro immediately to free Yosef from the bar in order to interpret his dreams. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu had a timetable. And in that timetable, a period of time would have to pass between the Saramashkim regaining his original status and his position and the dreams of Paro and freeing Yosef from the jail. This was all part of a well-planned scheme above. First of all, that at the end of a long period of incarceration, many, many years, that's when Yosef meets up with the Saramashkim Sarofim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have easily had it that immediately when the Saramashkim and Sarofim were thrown into jail, immediately at the beginning of Yosef's period in the jail, that's when the episode would have happened and he would have interpreted the dreams. No. Everything was well calculated. And that's going to mean that there's going to be an overlap between Yosef and the Saramashkim and the Sarofim of 1 full year. And what's the importance of Yosef spending that year in jail together with the Saramashkim and Sarofim until finally they had their dreams? They could have had their dreams. God could have organized it, that they had the dreams, etc., at the beginning of that year. Yosef had to be in the bar together with the Saramashkim Sarofim. Why? Lilmod taksise malchus. He would derive lessons, how to do it, of controlling a government, of being in control of a nation. To understand in any position of authority what he should do. Yosef would learn from the wisdom, the experience of the Saramashkim and Sarofim. Lachein cholmu, when did their dreams take place? God arranged it. Akshloshis yomim kodem seisam. Only at the end of this period of a year. Sheim cholmu kodem, if they had dreamt these dreams at the beginning of their incarceration, Az Sarofim katzaf olav, then immediately Paro would have put the Sarofim to death. And there would be no opportunity for the Sarofim to teach Yosef the nuances and the secrets, the byways of kingship and how to lead a country. So that Yosef was really taking a course here in political science. Don't think that these were bakers and butlers that played a minor role in Mitzrayim. No. They were the Sarei HaMedina. They were in charge of all the other offices in the Medina, in the country. Shal kol HaMashkim v'kol HaOfim. And also in collecting taxes and so forth and so on. So there's a divine plan. Now let's put this together with the previous paragraph. We're going to go backwards in this case. And Rabbi Meir Simcha writes the following. Hashgacha, the last 4 words in the paragraph, four lines in the paragraph. Hashgacha osisa sheyachlom gam Sarofim. Why was it critical in the divine plan that even the Sarofim would have a dream? I mean, he seems to be totally superfluous in this story. It's the Saramashkim who plays the major role. But God wanted the Sarofim to have a dream, the Yiftar lo l'ra'ah. And Yosef would interpret the dream for evil. As a result of the interpretation of the dream on the part of Yosef for the Sarofim, the Saramashkim would believe that Yosef was empowered with the ability to interpret dreams properly. If he had not witnessed the interpretation that Yosef offered for the Sarofim, the Saramashkim would have suspected that Yosef was just trying to appease him, try to fawn him. And give him a good feeling. But now that he saw that for the Sarah Ophim, he gave a Pitaron L'Ra'ah, he understood the Sarah Mashkim, that Yosef is interpreting the dreams correctly. And all this leads us to a conclusion that the entire life of Yosef, from the time he was sold into slavery, step by step, every segment, every episode, every challenge, and the timetable, it was all part of a divine plan. And Rabbi Simcha insists that Yosef would have certainly been expected to understand that the Hashgacha was behind the scenes and that everything that was happening was meticulously fulfilling the divine scheme. And therefore, Yosef is found lacking when he expects the Sarah Mashkim to get him out of the jail. And Chazal say that twice in the Pasuk, Yosef says, Kiyim Zachartani Leparo, and for those two times that Yosef said, Zachartani Leparo, please mention my name to Paro, he was punished for 2 extra years in the clink, in jail. Because he was expected, and it was demanded of Yosef to understand that he's got to wait for the right moment, that in Hashgacha Pratis, that's when he would get out of jail. Now, let's look at the beginning of Miketz. We don't even have to turn any pages. At the beginning of Miketz, Rabbi Simcha quotes a medrash. The medrash, based on a pasuk in Mishlei, the pasuk says, "Udvar svasayim achla machzor," that sometimes when you speak too much, it has the opposite negative effect, and Yosef said too much. Al yidei she'omar l'sara mashkim zechartani v'izkartani nitfas v'lo shtei shonim shenemar vayhi miketz, etc., etc. Kavanoso. How does the Medrash know that the reason why Yosef had to stay in the jail for another 2 years is because of the chait that he relied on the Sarah Mashkim? Maybe it was part of the divine plan that he would not leave the jail until a certain number of years. The Torah is revealing the way in which God rules the world from above, all the cause and effect relationship of the events that happen based on divine providence. As we discussed earlier, it was critical that the Tzar Tabachim would be there because he had a lot of experience in Tachsisei Malchus to share with Yosef. Yelame Darkei Malchus Laman Yuchal Liot Sar V'Sholit B'Medina Kazu, so that Yosef would know how to rise to the occasion to be the authoritative leader of this great nation. Asher Hoisa Mosheles Bekipa Uberum Malas HaChochma V'Askola. This was the most advanced nation in the civilized world at that time. And they had Malas HaChochma V'Aseichel. They were intellectually superior. They had developed on a very sophisticated level. At Khartoumim, the Kosmim, they had technologies that even to this day, we're not sure exactly how they were able to implement those. V'kasha Yoshav, when Yosef sat with Beis Asurim, Yoshav im Sarisim, Asher lemelech hamashke va'ofer, hayamisharis lifneim. Yosef took care of these 2 great officers. V'kibel mehem nimuse v'taksise malchus mitzrayim v'anagos. All this was part of a divine plan, so that Yosef would learn, as we said before, to take this course in political leadership. Omnam achrei sheyotzu sar mashkim va'ofen. Lo haya od toeles mitzivosem beis asurim. The Tanchuma asked the following question. We understand very well the extended period of time of Yosef's incarceration to learn from the Sarah Ofen, Sarah Mashkim, Tachsisei Molchama, Tachsisei Malucha. But now that they were freed and they were out of the jail, then the course ended. So why did Yosef have to stay in jail another 2 years? That was the question that bothered the mind of the Tanchuma. Rak shahaya al shesham bitsam bitchono be hasarim and siva hashgacha shel shachach saramashkim v'chu. That as a result of the fact that Yosef put all his trust into the Sarah Ophim, Sarah Mashkim, mostly Sarah Mashkim, of course. Therefore, if he's not relying on Hashgacha, but rather he's trying to see how, with how he can trust another human being to help him, then the Hashgacha will be removed, so to speak, will be pulled back, and Yosef will end up in jail for a longer period of time. Moving on in Parshas Miketz, we have the blessing that Yosef, the viceroy of Egypt, bestowed upon Binyamin. Elokim yechancha b'ni. This is in Perek Mem Gimel, Pasuk Chaf Tes, 43:29. And Rameir Simcha is bothered by the word b'ni. After all, Binyamin is a brother, he's not a son to Yosef. L'chibaso kra'o b'no. He calls him a ben out of his love for him. I love you like a son, like a father loves a son. Now that's an emotional statement, interpretation of why Yosef calls Binyamin b'ni. However, Aval Mikol Makom means on a deeper level, not on the subjective level of emotionalism, but rather on an objective level. There's a reason and a justification for Yosef calling his brother Binyamin B'ni. Lamadnu Shayachal Lios B'no. The Torah wants to teach us that Binyamin, because of the difference of age between Yosef and Binyamin, could have actually been the son of Yosef. So when Yosef uses the word B'no, B'ni, to describe Binyamin, it's not far from true. It could have been that he was his son. Now, 1 second. How much younger is Binyamin than Yosef? Quiz question. The answer is 8 years. That means that Yosef was 8 years old when Binyamin was born. And this is based on Parshas Vayetzer. Yosef was born at the end of the second, of the second 7-year period of time of Yaakov working in Beis Lavan. Right? He worked 7 years and he got Leah, and then another 7 years and he got Rachel. And then the Torah records that Rachel gave birth to Yosef. Binyamin nolad im boam chazara arza. Binyamin was born when they came back to the land. Hainu sheishanim avad avur atzon ushnatayim hoya b'derech. So there were 6 years in which Yaakov was working for the tzon of Lavan, and then he was on the road for another 2 years. 6 plus 2 is 8, and then Binyamin is born. So Yosef is older than Binyamin by 8 years. How then is it possible that Binyamin could have been the son of Yosef? And Rameir Simcha, with his Lamda Shekap, invokes a sugya in Perek More Ben Sora More, Sanhedrin Samachtes. And the Gemara says there, B'doros Rishonim, way back when, in the early generations, Yoldu L'shmona Shanim. You could father a child at the age of 8. And the Gemara derives this from B'tzalel ben Uri ben Chur Lamata Yehuda And it says, Vatomas Azuva, she was the wife of Kolev, Vayikach lo Kolev es Efrat, Vatelid lo es Chur. So the Gemara asks, V'chi Ovad Betzalel Mishkan Bar Kama Havi, when Betzalel finally worked to create the Mishkan, how old was he? Bar Tleisar. He was only 13 years old. Tiksiv ish ish mi malachto asher hema osir. So to make a long story short, there's a whole calculation here based on Betzalel that Bedoros Rishonim, a person could father a child at the age of 8. V'limdanu ki Yosef nigmar etzlo kleho lada lishmone shanim. Why is it important for us to know that Yosef could have been the father of Binyamin at the age of 8? Okay, it's very nice, but why would the Torah go out of its way to teach us that? And the answer is to teach us that his genital organs were functioning already at the age of 8. And again, why is that important for us? Ubechozos bi odo ben yudches shonim his apak al yitzro v'tokev chomo be'eshes potif. Yosef, at the time of the episode of Eshes Potifar, was all told 18 years old, but he was already sexually active. His organs were already mature for the last 10 years. And in the life of a young man, going through the passions of early adulthood, adolescence, and so forth, 10 years of celibacy. Again, it's 18 years, but 10 years after he was already mature. And yet, when he faces the Tokef Yetzer, the Yetzer Hara of Potifar, something that we can't even imagine. Tokef Chomo, he's at the height of his heat meaning his passions. And yet, it's apek be'eshes Potifar. Unbelievable. The HaTzadik Yosef is able to overcome those temptations, even though for that 10-year period he was already mature. And now we're going to begin Parshas Vayigash, and we're going to take a look at the first paragraph in the parsha in Rabbi Simcha. Again, it's a very short paragraph, but I think it's worthwhile studying. When Yehuda approaches Yosef, the viceroy of Egypt, at the beginning of Parshas Vayigash, and he tells the whole story, and he calculates the various children of Yaakov. When he mentions Yosef, not by name, but he says to Yosef, the Achiv Meis, that he had died. How could it be that Yehuda would say Yosef has died? I mean, Yehuda never saw Yosef die. He could not possibly have been 100% certain that Yosef had died. And the one who asked this question is Rashi, and Rashi offers the following answer: Mipnei Ayira, Binyamin had been described by Yosef. by Yehuda, when the brothers first came down to Mitzrayim, and they told him, Binyamin is too young and this and that. And immediately Yosef says, bring him down to Mitzrayim. He makes a condition. And therefore Rashi says that if Yehuda would have spilled the beans that Yosef ain't, we don't know where he is, but he might still be alive, then once again, Yosef would say, you know what, come back to me when you find your brother. If he's still alive, bring him to me. So in a state of nervous tension, when Yehuda is overwhelmed by the encounter with the viceroy of Egypt, of Yosef, and he knows so much is at stake. We know that what the viceroy had put them through the agony and so forth. So he immediately thought to himself, I better mention that my brother is dead. so that Yosef would not demand that we bring him down to Mitzrayim. Because Lefi di Asam, Ech Haya Mekucha Yosef li Aviv, Betach Ilu Haya B'Chaim, Haya Modia li Aviv B'Michtav Makoma. The first Meir Simcha in Parshas Vayigash. What's exactly going on? Rashi is bothered by the fact that that Yehuda is fabricating a lie when he says v'achiv meis. And Rashi could only justify this by saying that Yehuda was overwhelmed by fear. He was standing, shaking in his boots, over the possibility that the viceroy would once again find them guilty and demand, in this particular context, that they bring their brother back down to Mitzrayim. So in a knee-jerk response, without even thinking it out, Yehuda says, V'achiv meis. He's gone. Don't ask me to bring him down. He's dead. So the Sifsei Chachamim says, in explaining this Rashi, that in all likelihood, Yosef had died, meaning based on the knowledge that they had, Yosef was in all likelihood gone after all these years. But Reb Meir Simcha is not satisfied with that. He wants to justify Yosef, I'm sorry, I keep saying Yosef. He wants to justify Yehuda on a halachic basis, meaning based on our Torah and our law, Yehuda was not telling a lie when he said achiv meis. How is that possible? So again, just to see the difference here between Rashi's approach and that of the Meshech Chochma, is Rashi wants to justify it. It's actually a fabrication of the truth, and Yehuda made up the whole story when he said that Yosef mes, achiv mes. But we can justify that because Yehuda was in a helter-skelter mental state in which he was overwhelmed by fear. And he figured, look, as the Sifsei Chacham adds, probably in all likelihood he's dead. So therefore, but it really was not true in the sense that there's no way that Yehuda could have known with all certainty that Yosef had died. Now we'll learn Reb Meir Simcha. Short piece, but there's a lot here. Lefi di Asam, Ech Shahaya Mekushar Yosef li Aviv, Betach Ilu Haya B'Chaim Haya Modia li Aviv B'Michtav Mekomo. V'zem Mikri Bari. Rashi Ksubas Tav Chav Beis Amid Beis Biomeres Barilu. Okay, we're going to underline the next few words. I want to leave that for the end. First, I want to study with you the Gemara Ksubas. We're not going to go through the Sugi inside. But the case is where a married woman, her husband goes off to Medina Sayyam, and he doesn't return. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited, till finally two witnesses came to Beis Din, and they testified about this woman's husband, and we know that he died. Great, we have two witnesses, Meis Bailech. Obviously, she's an almana, she can get married to anyone she wants. But then another pair of two witnesses came in, and they testified lo meis, that the first pair of Eidim were purging themselves, and we know that he's alive and well. Now, we have what's called treyu trey. We don't know which of the pair of Eidim are telling the truth. They contradict each other. So the Gemara says that she's not allowed to get married. It's a suffix, and she can't get married. She might be an HSH because the two Eidim testify that her husband is alive. However, the Gemara makes a distinction between the following two cases. Case number one is right now on the table, we only have two witnesses testifying that her husband died, and she went in, she got married to another man based on these two witnesses. And after her marriage, two witnesses came by to contradict the original two witnesses and testify that her husband is achein a lot. And there's trey. And the Gemara says, at least according to one opinion, that Kevan Denises lotates it. Once she got married, then we will not bust up the marriage. We will not force again. So the Gemara asks a question for Oshan Polikot. Every minute that she has a relationship with this second husband that she married after the witnesses came is a suffix bias because we now have two Eidim who testify that her husband is achein a lot. So in a case of suffix, we have what's called an Asham Palui. You're going to tell me that we're going to allow her marriage to continue when she's obligated to bring an Asham Palui for every single intimate relationship she has with her husband? It can't be. So the Gemara adds three words as an answer to this problem. There's no Asham Tolui here. Be Omeres Barili. Bari means it's definite. She is claiming, I know for sure that my husband is dead. How does she know for sure? Did she see his body? Can she testify on the actual, the corpse is dead? And the Mefarshim explained that Shahab Barili, that she's so certain that he's gone, is based on the fact that he hasn't returned. If he was still alive, he would at least send a letter. I mean, today we have social media. You could post it on Facebook. I don't know what. And nothing. I didn't hear from him. All these months, this long period of time. It must be that he's dead. And based on that, we're going to allow her to continue living with her new husband because she's absolutely certain, and we can rely on her certainty that he's dead. Says Rameir Simcha brilliantly. Yosef was dead. How did Yehuda know that Yosef for sure was dead? And the answer is because why didn't he show up over all these years, 2 decades plus? Why didn't he write a letter? Didn't he know that his father was suffering with every minute, the agony and the grief and mourning over the loss of his son? Why didn't he write something? Why didn't he appear on the scene? Send a postcard. That's called Barili. And in the case of Barili, we see from the Gemara in Ksubis, that's considered Vadai, that's certainty. Says Rameir Simcha. If Yehuda was saying Barili, that Achiv Meis, it's not a fabrication of the truth. It's absolutely reliable evidence. And based on Barili, he could be certain, just like a woman who says, Barili, where's my husband? Where did he show up? Why did he send a letter? Why did Yosef send a letter? Now, in Parshas Vayigash, let's take a look at Perek Memhei Posuk Chaf Al. Agolos al pi paro. This is another example of Rameir Simcha using his lumdus, his halachic thinking cap, to interpret a parsha in the Torah. I think it's another wonderful example. Why does the Torah emphasize that these horse-driven chariots or wagons were sent to Yaakov al pi paro? Those are the three words in the Torah that Rabbi Simcha wants to call our attention to. Al pi paro. Says Rabbi Simcha Shesusim lo hayu motziyam mitzrayim lechutz lemedina b'li rishayim. The law of the land was that it was a violation of basic law in Mitzrayim to take horses out of Mitzrayim. The best stallions in the world, very special horses, were those that were owned by Mitzrayim. And the Mitzrayim didn't want to share that with other nations. And if these horses would end up in the hands of other nations, if somebody exported them from Egypt, and that nation would start breeding those horses. And they would reproduce, and they would now have competing horses. So you had to have a special license to permit taking horses from Egypt outside of the borders. And the license would only be given on the following condition. Sheyotim hayumisarser. They would have to castrate the horses to guarantee that there in Chutzla Mitzrayim, nobody would breed the horses and create a new nation to compete with horses against Mitzrayim. He quotes a Mishnah in Meshech Bechoros, she'ein para v'chazira v'sirus asul benoach. Sirus, castration, is one of the isurim that applies to a ben Noach. And that's based on a Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis. And the Gemara has a whole pilpul. How do we derive this conclusion that a non-Jew is enjoined from castrating an animal? V'im kain, if Yosef is going to take the horses of Mitzrayim to ride the chariots and go back to Eretz Canaan, and he has the license for Paro to do so, but Yosef now knows that Paro is going to have to castrate these horses. And in so doing, there'll be a violation of Sirus, which applies even to a Ben Noach. And therefore, Yosef, by facilitating this entire Chadgadya, taking the horses and forcing the government to castrate the horses, Yosef himself would be violating an Isur of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitein Michshol. And this is based on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah. The Gemara says that if you give to a guy an idol to worship, then you violate Lifnei Iver. Even a guy is included, as far as the Jew is concerned, in the violation of Lifnei Iver. Lachen, therefore the Torah emphasizes al pi paro. Huchrach l'shloach al pi paro. It means that Yosef did not get involved at all in this decision and this license to permit taking the horses down to Eretz Canaan. It was all al pi paro. This was Paro's initiative and his decision. V'hu tziva l'sarson v'lishlach hagolos. And since it was Paro who gave the tzivui, not Yosef, therefore Yosef is exonerated from the violation of Lifnei Iver. He had no part in Paro's decision to be Mesaris the animals.
There is a pasuk that says that Yosef sent the Agadas.
Oh, so Rav Soloveitchik, this is what I discussed last night. I didn't see Rabbi Simcha address this question. So you know what? Let's just see. We have approximately 10 minutes to finish. So, B'li Neder, if you want, after we finish, I'll share with you Rav Soloveitchik's brilliant insight into reconciling that contradiction. Let's take a look here in Vayigash. In Perek Mem Vav, Pasuk Dalet. Second. Anochi ereidi mach, v'Yosef yoshis yado aleinech. So this is the conversation, the dialogue between Yaakov and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when Yaakov is so overwhelmed by fear about going down to Mitzrayim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is basically comforting Yaakov Avinu about this episode that's about to take place. He says, Ki inyan shel Yosef yoshis yado aleinecha, ha'inyan yatzo meinecha, shebal tachkar ubal tistakel achrei darkei ashkoch. The idea of closing your eyes has the purpose of telling man not to think too deeply with all sorts of chakiros, all sorts of investigations, analyses of darkei ashkoch. Ki kemo, ki milel, mi milel zeh, asher atzar shel Yosef yel tachlis nirtza kozeh. Who could have ever expressed and formulated the idea that all the misery, all the challenges that Yosef would face was all for tachlis hanirtza, all for a great goal and a great purpose. Sheyadur b'Mitzrayim, that Yosef would live in Mitzrayim and then he would rise and ascend via l'shalit, via farsem deos sodkos, and there in Mitzrayim, Yosef would have an impact on the beliefs of the Mitzrayim by constantly emphasizing that it's all part of a divine plan. So that according to Rabbi Simcha, the ultimate goal of Yosef rising to the Sholet al Mitzrayim is not just because of the need and the role that Yosef would fill in guaranteeing the sustenance of Mitzrayim, etc., but moreover, Yosef would have a spiritual message to convey, to teach in Mitzrayim. And Yefarsem Deos Sodkos. V'chol ha'aretz yu kfufim lo. And everyone would be influenced by Yosef, the leader's influence, which is sometimes unfortunate, but in this case, it's a good thing. Halo zeh ha'inyan dai lasum yad ulechasos hashkafos einecha v'abotas havanasecha mucheshes. He says, look, cover your eyes. Don't try, Yaakov Avinu, to be choker v'dorish now that you find out that Yosef suffered as he did for 22 years and the entire Hishtalshalus, and you're wondering about Darkei Hashem. Leave that all. Just understand one thing, that your son Yosef has maintained a spiritual commitment to faith, and he has had a tremendous positive, uplifting impact on the entire society of Mitzrayim. They look up to him, they're mushpa from him, and then, if you want, we could fill in the details later, the nuances of step by step what happened in Yosef's life and why it was part of Hashkafas Hashem. Now, just to round things off here in Parshas Vayigash, I want to point out a short piece in Reb Meir Simcha at the beginning of Perek Mem Zayin. Really read the pasuk inside. Let me just read it. It says, "Vayovel Yosef vayaged leFaro, vayomer aviv achai v'tzonamu b'karam v'kol shalem bo me'eretz Canaan v'hinam b'eretz Goshen." And this is Yosef's plan to see to it that the brothers and Yaakov would be settled in Goshen. And the emphasis here in Rabbi Simcha is on Sonam Ubekaram. Lo Zachar Yosef bebisro leparo es boam shel bnei mishpachto lemitzrayim es hanoshim kimo shezachar paro mishum shekakara lehem bisara v'chashash shema gam b'neshem. Rabbi Simcha is bothered. Why is it that in our pasuk we have a record of a transcript, I would say, of Yosef telling Paro about the Bnei Mishpach who are coming to Mitzrayim, and he mentions that they came with their bakar and their son. Why did he mention they came men, women, and children, meaning with their wives? And earlier in Parshas Vayigash, Perek Mem Hey Pasuk Yutes, Chu lachem eretz Mitzrayim agalos l'tapchem u'l'shechem. Paro had commanded Yosef to go back to Canaan with these agalos and transport their children and the shechem, your wives. And yet here, Yosef doesn't say a word about the wives. Why is Yosef omitting mention of the wives? And Rabbi Simcha says that to answer this apparent contradiction, where Paro is saying, bring your wives, and Yosef doesn't mention a word about his wives, it's because of what happened with Sarah. That just like in Paro's time, they took Sarah, now they would take the wives of the brothers. And there Yosef deliberately omitted any mention of the wife. So we have 2 minutes left. I would like to address Doniel's question about the Agolos. And I have here in front of me a transcript of a short paragraph from Rav Soloveitchik. Let me see, just give me a minute to find it. I know it's here. Oh. So he has a long discussion about the pasuk, which describes Yaakov seeing Asher Shalach Yosef Vayaris Hagolos. And Rashi says the significance of the Hagolos is because Yosef was intimating the sugya of Egla Rufa, which is the last sugya that they learned together before he was sold and they were separated. And there's an entire discussion here, which I'm not going to get into, about the meaning of Egla Rufa and what was the significance as far as Yosef and his role as the leader of Mitzrayim. What was the message of Eglah Rufa? Fine. Now it says, Ba'golos asher sholach paro. But we just saw that the pasuk says the Agolos was sent by Yosef. So Rav Soloveitchik says, again, it's just 2 lines, but I just think we can embellish it in our own words and expand upon it. There are actual physical wagons, and then wagons as a spiritual message, an ideal, something abstract, not physical and material. Pharaoh sent actual wagons, but Yosef's Agolos were ideals, meaning they were conceptual, they were messages. And they were messages of leadership that we derive from the parsha of Eglah Rufa. So that while it's true that it was really Paro who sent the Agolos, and that we saw Rabbi Simcha had to be, because otherwise Yosef would have violated Lifnei Iver, because they sent these horses that would draw the carriages to Sirus to be castrated, and that Yosef couldn't have a hand in that. But nevertheless, Yosef, once the deed was done, meaning after the horses were prepared, Yosef would send these Agolos as a message to his father Yaakov about leadership, responsibility, like the Zkedim at the time of the Eglah Rufa, the Rufa Sayeg. And Yosef wanted to tell his father that he was living up to that message of Jewish leadership, the Jewish ethical standard of leadership, even though he was in Mitzrayim in a very adverse kind of society, but nevertheless, he filled that role and he maintained his commitment to the Eglah Rufa philosophy of leadership. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop. If anyone wants to learn Daf Yomi, we'll start Daf Yomi in about 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.